Hey, Grace Church, this is Pastor Chelsea, and I want to welcome you to 12 Weeks of Grace, a journey toward anti-racism. We are in week 5 of our series, and this week is all about the topic of race and gender. In this week's resources, you are going to hear the term intersectionality quite a bit. This term, intersectionality, was first used by Kimberly Crenshaw, a law professor, in 1989. Crenshaw is a professor at UCLA and Columbia. She is an African American woman, and she first used this term, intersectionality, to describe how aspects of a person's social and political identities, especially when those aspects of one's identities are in minority communities, how they combine, how they overlap, and often lead to particular points of discrimination, and how they can lead to points when they are in the majority of privilege. So Crenshaw uses this term to talk about how gender, how sex, how race and class, how religion or physical ability, how height, how all of these different parts of our identity, all of these different ways that we move through the world interact together, and they have an influence on the privilege and the discrimination that we experience. Crenshaw was particularly writing for African American women in the early 90s, and she was writing about how an African American woman's perspective is often ignored when we are talking about feminist issues. When we talk about issues of gender, especially when we are talking about feminism, we often group that as a whole. And yet Crenshaw wants to point out that the experience of African American women is very different than the experience of white women, is very different than the experience of Hispanic and Latino women, and the list goes on and on. Crenshaw now writes about how the experiences of women are also broken down into class, how they're also broken down into sexuality. So the experience of trans women is really different than the experience of heterosexual women. And on and on and on. Crenshaw writes about how, again, these different aspects of our identities play a role in how we see the world, and they play a role in how we experience the world. I was especially influenced this week by the TED Talk that is in the comment section of this YouTube video and is in the resources in our weekly email. Crenshaw gives this TED Talk to highlight a lot of her teachings, to highlight the research that she has been doing over the last few decades, and for all that she has learned since she first used that term in 1989. As a white woman, I have really come to appreciate Crenshaw's work. It has called me out on my own privilege, on my own bias, on my own ignorance at times, for the ways that I have taken things for granted, for the ways that I have grouped voices together that maybe they weren't all saying the same thing, right? This term intersectionality and this point this week on race and gender especially are to help us realize that each of our voices, each of our experiences are uniquely different. That while we may have some things in common, while we may all be fighting for social change, while we may all be working towards living lives that are anti-racist, that how we approach this conversation, how we see the world is really different, again, depending on those social and political identities that we hold. So I hope that you will take a dive into Crenshaw's work, that you will give a listen to her TED Talk, that you will spend some time in the articles that are also attached, specifically looking a little more nuanced at race and gender, diving into a particular area of intersectionality. And I hope that you will continue to engage in this conversation together, that you will join Reverend Jim and myself on Monday at 1:30 as we dive into these resources via Zoom, that you will share in the comment section how this is making sense for you or questions that you still have, and that you will continue this dialogue together. Friends, we know that this journey is complicated. We know that the work of living lives that are anti-racist are tricky, that we are often going to get it wrong, that we are often going to need to take a step back and to reevaluate, but we are grateful that you are on this journey with us. We are grateful that you are continuing to dive into these resources and continuing to be in conversation with us as a staff. And so enjoy this week. Enjoy Crenshaw's voice, and again, glad to be on this journey together.